Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast, a podcast for the disruptive workplace leader. Join host Jessica Miller-Merrill, founder of WORKOLOGY.com, as she sits down and gets to the bottom of trends, tools, and case studies for the business leader, HR, and recruiting professional who is tired of the status quo. Now here's Jessica with this episode of WORKOLOGY.
Welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast, sponsored by Clear Company. The economy is strong, and companies are working hard to ride the bull market. That means taking the bull by the horns and focusing on driving maximum performance, revenue, and profitability. That's easier, though, than it sounds. Employee engagement, retention, and recruiting are all at the forefront of creating a high-performance culture. The real question is, what's the recipe for success to get the most out of your employees without alienating and driving them away? Today I'm joined by Jason Lawrenson. He's a self-described corporate executive gone rogue who speaks on a wide variety of topics around performance, engagement, and leadership. He's also the author of a new book just out called Unlocking High Performance. Jason, welcome to the WORKOLOGY podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm excited to hear all the insights and nuggets of wisdom that you're going to share with us today. Talk to us a little bit about your background. I love the description of corporate executive gone rogue.
Yeah, well, I don't even get to claim credit for that. I get to claim credit for the career part of it, but the actual label itself was something that someone else put on me. I think because throughout my career, I'm not really cut out for long-term employment relationships, apparently, because I'm kind of a get in, diagnose, fix it, and move to the next thing. And so I think when my last corporate job kind of spit me back out, I tend to be the kind of person that leaders find really interesting and helpful for a while, but then they get exhausted because they're tired of fixing things and being told that things could be better. And so I tend to be good in small doses. And so that's kind of how I ended up with that reputation. But my professional background started in sales, moved into recruiting, third-party recruiting. That's kind of where I fell in love with the dynamics of people and work and how all of that works. And that led me into just shy of a decade in corporate HR. And then when HR was done with me, or I was done with it, or whatever, in a formal relationship, I popped out because I felt like I could be of more use and more help on this side, working with leaders in HR professionals on how to build better workplaces. So that's what I do today through speaking and some advising and writing and that sort of thing. So very weird winding path of a career, but that's me.
We've talked about this before. We're sort of parallel paths, right? Similar stories, just not fitting in, but have an opportunity to share and serve the larger workplace community.
Yep. And happily unemployable, I guess, is how I would describe myself.
In your new book, you talk about not just high performance, but you also say that work is broken. Walk us through what you mean about that and more about your book. Sure.
Well, I think there's two levels on which I would argue work is broken. I think that the most obvious one, and what brought me to this body of work, is the experience that employees are having every day. And we hear about it. I hear about it. I see it through the work that I do in surveys and that. And so that's what led me to kind of dig in deeper. But fundamentally, I believe that work is broken at a model level or at a system level. And what that looks like is that primarily when work was originally kind of set up, when our current model of management came into existence, it was during a time when really labor contracts kind of governed how work worked. And so it was really came to be managed or thought of as a contract. And we really never outgrew that. And even today, most employers still think about and manage work as if it's governed by some sort of contract, whether it's legal or psychological. But the idea is, as an employer, I offer you up salary and benefits and exchange employee for your time and effort and energy in creating work product. And most of the systems that we have in place in organizations, whether it's management systems, HR systems, are all designed around ensuring compliance with that contract, making sure the company gets its money's worth out of the employee. That's performance appraisals, job descriptions, policy manuals, all of those things. But what the data says, when you look at the employee engagement data, everything we've seen over the last 10 or 20 years about employee satisfaction, engagement, all of that, it tells us that the things that are really important to employees that motivate them to higher performance are things like feeling valued at work, trust, feeling cared for, being appreciated, all of those kind of relational kind of experiences. And what occurred to me was that as you look at that, work looks a lot more like a relationship for the employee than it does a contract or anything else. And so you have this disconnect between employers treating work as a contract and employees experiencing work as a relationship. And I think that's fundamentally where work is broken. And until we align those things, until organizations start redesigning work to feel like a healthy relationship for the employee, we're not ever going to create a work experience that really optimizes performance. And that's what my book is about, is how to do that.
Awesome. The book also talks a lot about high performance and then performance management. So how are those two aligned, or maybe what are some ways that organizations can align those two so that we're getting the most out of people, they're happy, and also they're performing to our expectations?
Sure. Well, I think one of the challenges we have as we talk about whether it's high performance or managing performance is that we have to step away from what I think we've traditionally thought of when we think of performance management with it, which is an appraisal or an event that's designed strictly around kind of assessing the employee's performance for purposes of assigning bonuses or assigning other things based on merit, and realize that performance management is kind of the lifeblood of what an organization exists for. I mean, organizations exist to perform, and performance management needs to be thought more of as a system and a set of processes that are designed around helping the employee have an experience that encourages them or unlocks them, if you will, to perform at their best. So there's a lot of different levels to that, but it's less about an event or a particular, filling out a form like it has been thought of traditionally. And it's more about what kind of experience can we create, whether we're the leader and we're thinking about the entire organization, or whether I'm a manager thinking about my team. What kind of an experience can I create for my employees that helps them feel better about their work and therefore more willing to, or interested in, or more able to give more of their talents and performance to the organization or to their job. So that's really it's a mindset shift first, I think, and then it's more broad than just that one interaction a year.
So let's say that we want to create a better experience for our employees. How do we start that conversation with the employees? Is there a secret formula, or is there a best practice that we should be thinking about?
Well, there's probably two ways to address that or answer that question. I do think there are some foundational or fundamental things that need to be in place in order to create a great experience that optimizes or unlocks higher performance. And that I unpack those things in the book in sort of three sets of processes that I put under the heading performance planning, cultivation, and accountability. Those are kind of the three buckets. And within each of those, there's a set of processes, broadly set of processes, things like clarity of expectations, making sure that both your very specific job and behavioral expectations are clear, making sure we're recognizing and appreciating employees, those kinds of fundamental things. The way you go about doing that might be a little bit different. So I think there are some basics like that I try to help people understand, that these are things that it doesn't matter what kind of employee you have or where you're at, that are important foundationally. The way that you go about delivering that, though, has a lot to do with the type of business you're in or the type of organization that you run, or what is important to your organization culturally or through your values. And so the second way I would ask that is go have a conversation with your employees. So when you're talking about how, what's the most effective way to appreciate and recognize, for example, there is no single right answer to that. You have to actually engage with people and have conversations with them in order to sort out what the right approach is for your team or the people that you lead or supervise. And so there's a structure that can help you ask the right questions, but then you got to go out and you got to engage with people and have some conversations with them to really frame up what the right process looks like for your organization or your team.
I think this is an important point for you to make, because there's no silver bullet to any of this. And I think a lot of times we want to go to that. We're like, yes, there is a formula that's working for Google, and we have to do all the things that Google is doing, or Netflix, or whoever the organization, maybe from a book or a podcast that we listen to, but it's not that simple.
No. And, it's funny that you say that, because the way that I think of when I was even writing the book and the way I describe it now is that the middle part of my book is really where I go into breaking down, each of these, three things: planning, cultivation, and accountability, and then sort of the sub processes within that. And then that's loaded up with a bunch of different case studies and examples from different organizations where, they are delivering on this. They're doing it well, but they do it in different ways. And so I describe that middle part of the book almost like a cookbook. Because when you think about creating a great meal, oftentimes, there's certain things you want to have, on your plate. You want to have a meat or a protein and a vegetable and a whatever, and a carbohydrate or whatever. But each, there's different recipes, and what exactly you put together depends on the kind of meal you're trying to prepare or whatever. And I think same thing is true here. There is no single right answer. I mean, you need to fill each of those three buckets with some of these things, but the way you go about it and what that right recipe is going to look like for you is really dependent on doing some work to understand your employees and your particular cultural construct and what you're trying to accomplish. And so it's going to look a little bit different depending on who you are.
I like the idea about recipes, because different people have different restrictions for meals, or they're on a specific diet plan that's custom and different for everyone. So you have your family, or you're hosting your meal just like you're working at an organization. So you have to take all those different pieces into consideration.
That you do. So I found that to be helpful for me, at least in thinking about that. And I hope that people will find that helpful as they use the book.
The cookbook for high performance in the workplace.
Yeah, we could have called it that, but probably nobody would have bought it. That's too right up front with that. Nobody wants to cook in HR, I guess, at work.
Yeah, the marketing, I can't really make that connection, but I can when you explain it during the podcast.
Right.
Let's take a reset. This is Jessica Miller Merrill, and you're listening to the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. Today, we're talking with Jason Lawrenson about driving high performance and creating a performance culture in your workplace. You can connect with Jason on Twitter at Jason Lawrenson. That's at JasonLauritsen.
This podcast is sponsored by Clear Company. Clear Company is the world's fastest growing talent management platform, allowing companies to easily hire, retain, and engage more A-players. Visit clearcompany.com to sign up for a free demo.
Let's circle back to performance management for a minute. What does a well-balanced performance management system look like?
Well, I think it's back to the cookbook, right? We're a lot of that has to do with, when I think about it, the meal, if we go back to the cookbook example and the meal example, there needs to be these three components to the system. I call it in the book a performance management system that has to have planning, cultivation, and accountability. Each of those three things is really important. And so, and if I talk about that just quickly, planning is, as I mentioned earlier, really about expectation clarity. It's clarity of goals and objectives, behavioral expectations, really understanding kind of the why and how of your job. So we need clarity around that. Cultivation is a piece that I think is often missed. And cultivation is, I grew up on a farm, and so I use farming as an analogy here, is that farmers, one of the things I've learned from being around farmers was that farmers know that their crops were genetically programmed to perform so long as they create the right conditions and they remove as many obstacles as they can that prevent growth and performance from happening. They call that work cultivation. I don't think we do that very well in our organization. So this is a piece that often gets missed. And this is things like motivation, appreciation, well-being, making sure that people feel whole and able and capable of giving their best, inclusion, right? Allowing them to bring all of the things that are most important. So there needs to be those processes around cultivation so that people are even able to and motivated, willing to give their very best. And then accountability is about predominantly feedback and measurement. But within that, there's also a component of reflection, allowing people to kind of put them in a position where they can reflect on, they understand and can reflect on their own contributions of performance and make decisions about how they want to improve going forward. And so that's what, as you think about the recipe, those are the components or the different, I guess, dishes that need to be included in your meal that you're serving up here in your performance management system. The work is really figuring out the right way to do that. It's using design and some process internally, engaging with your organization to figure out what the right mix of that looks like, and then also what the right cadence of it looks like, how often makes the most sense, and sort of putting the pieces together so that it feels like it's an ongoing process as opposed to a one-off, hit and miss process throughout the year.
You have a recent article that you published on your site titled, "Why Performance Management Still Sucks." I love when you said this: managers are charged with the day-to-day responsibility of ensuring employee performance. Leaders are broadly responsible for organizational performance, and HR is where the formal, compliance-based processes for the appraisal of performance. Companies want to put all the onus and responsibility of performance management on HR. How can HR help ensure that this high-performance culture and the conversations are balanced and it's not just all about HR, do this, make this happen?
Well, I think part of the what I was trying to drive to in that particular post, the punchline of that post is that the reason performance management still sucks in most places is because nobody does truly own it. The leaders want HR to own it. HR is saying, well, we've got these processes, but we don't actually impact performance on a day-to-day basis. That's the managers, or that's you as leaders. Why aren't you doing your job? And really, even if you look in most traditional HR organizations, there's not, it's funny. I know of one conference. There was still one conference out there that was oriented towards performance management. It was a performance management conference, and they actually last year they decided after that last one they're going to cancel it because they can't get a number of people up. And it's not because performance management isn't a big issue. It's because they don't know. Nobody knows who to send because it's unclear who owns, even within HR. Even when leaders are pointing at HR, even within HR, that's not clear who owns performance management. Everybody, it's even in HR, it's in different buckets when they do try to own the processes. And so I think if you're in HR and you're trying to make this a priority in your organization, you need to have some conversations with leadership about accountability and ownership of this thing we call performance, of who ultimately is responsible for processes related to performance. And I think honestly it's best if it lives or ownership of it probably lives outside of HR, whether that's in operations or at an organizational leadership level. I do think somebody needs to be responsible for the processes and the systems that enable and support performance management, because without it, we end up where we are today, where you get really inconsistent results. And if you happen to be a good manager who happens to learn how to do this, you can have big impact or drive great results, but it's not happening organizationally. So I do think we need to engage the leaders in a conversation about ownership of these processes, but also making it clear that these processes only exist to enable those who truly can impact performance on a day-to-day basis, and that's anyone who's managing people or leading people on a day-to-day basis. So I know that's not a very clear answer, but I think it's getting clear about internal ownership of process, but also making sure that we're holding the people responsible for managing performance on a day-to-day basis who can actually do it or who actually have that impact on people. And those are your actual people managers.
We'll include a link in the transcript of the podcast, Jason's episode here. It'll be included, and a link to that article on why performance management sucks. So you can directly have access to it and get more insights from what he's been talking about. Jason, thank you so much for joining the Workology podcast. Can you talk about where people can go to get your book, Unlocking High Performance?
Sure. Well, any place you can find books, it should be available. Hopefully, the easiest place is Amazon. If you go to Amazon and look up Unlocking High Performance, that's an easy place to find it. Or if all else fails, just go to my website. You already mentioned jasonlortzen.com. You hit their front page. We're pretty proud of the book. So it's right there on the front page and with some links on how to get it. So that's, but it should be pretty easy to find with any luck. If we're done doing our job on marketing, it shouldn't be hard to find.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
At Workology, we're making HR learning and recertification simple with Learn, our on-demand learning platform providing 24/7 access to pre-approved HRCI and SHRM courses. Visit workology.com/learn to find out more. And use the discount code PODCAST to save 20% off your membership. Now, back to Jessica.
Jason's approach sounds so simple, but you and I know that creating a high-performance company and culture is not an easy task. So grab a copy of his new book. It's packed full of great insights and best practices to have you and your organization humming along at optimal performance in no time, or at least a clear path for a recipe for success. Thank you for joining the Workology podcast sponsored by Clear Company. This podcast is for the disruptive workplace leader who's tired of the status quo. This is Jessica Miller Merrill. Until next time, visit workology.com to listen to all our previous podcast episodes.
Production services for the Workology podcast with Jessica Miller Merrill provided by TotalPicture.com.